Hi guys, you might have heard the name of table valued functions. So what are they? Are they the same as any database functions? In this video, we'll be talking about what are the inline table valued functions and what is the difference between table valued and scalar functions with the help of some examples. So stay tuned. So first thing first, we're going to start with the table valued functions. So what are table valued functions? Table valued functions are very similar to views, as we have talked about in the previous video. Views are basically a virtual table, and the best thing about this table valued functions is that it actually supports the input parameters as well. And it returns a table, which we're going to be talking about now. So let's take a look on the example. Now we'll just have a closer look at the example in SQL Server. So I've got the SQL Server running right here, and I've got the AdventureWorks 2012 database. So basically I've got two tables, which is basically human resources.employee table and human resources.employee pay history table. So if I actually go ahead and query these tables, we can see it's just taking a bit. So we can see that there are two tables, and there is actually the first table has got the employee information, whereas the other table has got the employee pay history, where it's recording the history of the rate and the pay frequency of the employees. So what I'm going to do is basically have a join of the tables. Now I have just actually written a join query, which is basically an inner join query, and I'm just joining the employee table with the employee history table. So employee pay history it is, and I'm just gonna go ahead and run this query, and it will give me a join of the table. So basically it's a result set, and what it's doing, it's actually joining both the tables. Now what I'm gonna do is, now I'm just gonna actually include a syntax before the query to make it a function. And what I'm going to do is basically write the function, the keyword create function, and then I'm going to give it a name, which is the name of the function. Let's call it fn underscore employee pay. And then what we're going to do is basically we're going to write some parameters. So we're going to say, all right, range 1. And let's call it integer, and we're gonna say range 2 and call it integer, and then we're gonna say returns, and then we're gonna say we're gonna return a table with this function. And now we're just gonna include the keyword as, and then we're gonna say return, and then we're just gonna write the query in the brackets, and this would actually create the function here. And what I'll do is, I'll further actually specify the condition as well. So what basically I'm doing is I'm actually recording, I'm taking two inputs here, which is range 1 and range 2 in the form of integers. And what actually I'm doing is basically with this result set, I'm gonna further filter it with the values. So what I'm gonna do is basically I'm gonna give a range of the values for the IDs of the employees. And for that, I'm just going to include, I'm going to say the business entity ID, and let's call it the business entity ID of the first table, which is business entity ID. Let's go on the second line. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to introduce the keyword between, and then I'm going to give the range, which I'm actually taking as the input parameters here, and I'm just going to specify the range values here. And if I just go ahead and execute this, so basically it's giving me an error because it says the column names in each viewer functions must be unique. So the column names are actually not unique in this one. Now the reason of this error is because it's actually getting confused when you're actually selecting star from this table and we're having a join. So both the tables got the business entity ID and it's confused which business entity ID to retrieve. So what we're gonna do is basically we're gonna specify the columns which we are interested in. So let's specify. I'm just gonna have the look at the table again. So the tables actually are here, as you can see. So let's grab business entity ID from the first table. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say e dot business entity ID. So this is where it was getting confused at. And then I'm gonna say e dot job title. So I'm gonna grab the two columns from the first table, and then I'm gonna grab from the second table. I'm interested in the rate, and let's call it, and the pay frequency as well. I'll make sure I've got the spelling right. Yep, let's go frequency. And let's take it to the next line. If I go ahead and run this query now, and now actually the function is being created. So now what we have is basically we have a employee payment function, and what we're basically doing is we're actually taking two parameters, which is basically the range of the values. So the first range and the second range in the form of integers, and then we're basically, and what we're doing is we're returning a table, and then we have a query here, just like the view basically. So basically it's a parameterized view. We got the query, we got a join query, and we're actually specifying the values we got here in the where clause, and we're actually having that values used in the business entity IDs. So this is the range of the values we're interested in. Now, in order to use the functions, in order to use the table valued functions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a select query. So let's write a select star query from fn, and I'm going to specify the function name, employee payment, and I'm just going to specify the values here. So I'm going to give an input of the input parameters for the functions. So let's call it, let's say 2, and that will be the first value, and the second value will be 10. So we got two values here, 2 and 10, and let's go ahead and run the query. So this would actually give me a result set, which is basically will have a range of 2 and 10s. So starting from 2, it will actually give me the range of the employees with their job titles, a rate, and the frequency. So basically it's giving me an inner join of the two tables. So we got that query basically, which was the result set, and it's got the range of the values as well. So please note, in this table valued functions, what we're doing is basically we're doing select star from the table. So it's not basically what we do in the scalar functions. We actually do we basically use the function here, and now what we're doing is basically we're using a function as if it was basically a table, and that is basically the table valued functions. So what it basically does, it actually just like we actually use the views. So we use the same thing, and we use the same with the table values functions with the help of the values as well. So we give some parameters, and with those parameters, what we're doing is basically we're using those parameters to filter the result set. So now let's have a look at the scalar functions. So what are scalar functions? So scalar functions basically returns a value. Scalar functions actually takes one or more parameters as well. It actually may or may not take input parameters. So what basically scalar functions does, it basically simplifies your code. So for example, you may have a complex calculation that that can appear in many queries. So instead of writing the complex formula in every query, you can just write a function with the help of that function and passing the input values, you can actually get the result, your desired result. So we have two types of functions here. The first one is the built-in function, which basically there are a lot of built-in functions in the SQL Server. I'll show you the example as well. And then we have the user-defined functions. So let's have a closer look at the example now. And now we have the SQL Server right here running. I'll first of all show you the built-in functions in SQL Server. So I'm gonna select, and let's introduce the first built-in function we have, which is basically the max function. So what it actually does, it will select the max result and return that one, and whatever input parameter we're gonna give it, it will actually select the max on that expression. So max, and let me give the same example. What I'm gonna do is basically I'm gonna use the same table, which is basically the employee pay history table. And in the employee pay history table, I actually had a column with the rate, which tells me the pay rate. So I'm gonna say pay rate, and let me see if I'm getting it right. So that was called actually rate. So rate, and then I'm gonna select it from human resources dot employee pay history table. And if I actually go ahead and run this query, it will give me the value, which is the maximum value of the rate from the employee pay history table. So 125.50 is basically the maximum rate in the employee pay history table. So let's have the average of the rate from the employee pay history table. That's another built-in function in SQL Server. If I go ahead and run this query, that will give me the average of the employee pay history table. So that is basically the average rate in this table, and the value is 17.7588. So that was basically the built-in functions. Now we're going to talk about the user-defined functions in SQL Server. So this is what I've done. I've actually created a very similar user-defined function that what we actually did in regard to the table value function. But what I've done here is basically I'm returning a sum of the rates from the employee pay history table. So I've got a query here, which is basically it's having a sum basically, which is a built-in function, and it's returning the sum of the employee pay, or the sum of the rates from the employee pay history table, and it's actually doing it, and it's actually taking a filter based actually the condition, which will be based on the ranges that we're giving in the function. So what I've done is basically I've created a function with the name of UFN get sum, and I've given two ranges as the input parameters. And the basic function, the basic thing to identify, and which is the basic difference between the table valued function and the scalar valued function, is that the table valued function returns a table, whereas the scalar function basically returns a value, a scalar value. And in this example, we're returning an integer, and the rest were basically we're actually beginning the code here, or basically we're declaring the value, we're declaring a variable with basically an integer variable, and then we're selecting, and we're actually storing the result set in that variable. And then we say that if the variable is null, then we return it, we set it to 0, and then return the variable. So if it's actually null, it will return 0, otherwise it will return the value, whatever the value is gonna be. So let's go ahead and run this and create this function, so we can say that the function has been executed successfully. So now what I'm gonna do is basically I'm gonna write this function, I'm gonna call this function, and to call this function, this is very important to understand that I have to call this function right here. It's not actually the same as we used to do it in the table valued functions, where we used to call the functions where we call the tables. So we call the functions where we actually call the column names. So because this is a scalar value function, and then we're going to do is basically I'm going to specify the range of the values. So let's give the same range of the values, which is 2 and 10. So that will be the IDs of the employees. So we're interested in the in getting the result in the sum of the rates of employee IDs, which actually ranges from 2 to 10. And then we're going to say from, and let's give it a table name, which is basically human resources dot employee pay history. And let's go ahead and run this query. So this is because, and the reason it's giving me a display error is because it's not recognizing the built-in function name, is because I forgot to include the DBO dot with the function name, and there's no use of actually using the from keyword and specifying the table name, because we've already done that in the function. So let's go ahead and execute this function, and let's see that I've got the value, which is the scalar value, which basically the scalar function does is actually return me the value, which is the sum of the rates of the pay rates from the employee pay history table within the range 2 and 10. So this is basically the value, which is basically the sum of the values of the employees from 2 to 10, which is basically their the sum of their employee pay rates. So hope that actually explains the difference between the scalar value function and table value function. So the very important thing to note is that scalar valued function, you have to specify it where you actually specify the columns, whereas the table valued functions, you specify it where you specify the tables, as it's basically a table value function and it actually returns a table. Hope that actually clears the difference between the scale value functions and table valued functions. And thanks a lot for watching the video, and you have a great day. Thank you.